The first place I start with is we're not talking about changing who you are. We're talking about making small little tweaks in what you do. I describe much of who we are as hardwired. Our emotions, our traits, our intellect, those things aren't going to change. But how you show up with those, how you express those can be small little changes that have huge impact. Coaching comes from athletics and sports, and what happens for elite athletes? You know, the golf coach changes your grip by 1/4 of an inch and you get 20 more yards on your drive, or the ski instructor has you bend your knees and lead forward a tiny bit more, and all of a sudden you're skiing effortlessly. So that's what we're focusing on, is what are the really small changes that are going to have a huge impact.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to another episode of Leadership. My guest this time is Dr. Martin Dubin. He's a clinical psychologist turned entrepreneur turned executive coach. In the world of personal development, Marty is making waves with his new book. It's titled Blindspotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. If you've ever wondered why your usual tools stop working or why feedback feels off the mark, this conversation will likely challenge your assumptions and offer a blueprint for transformation. We'll dive into the hidden forces that shape our leadership and take a look at what could be holding us back. Marty Dubin, welcome to Leadership.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, Roger.
Let's begin with this question. Can you explain the term blind spot in the context of leadership, and how does a blind spot differ from just a simple mistake or a personality trait?
Sure. As a business coach, when I would have people who are unfamiliar with that profession, what I did, I used to have kind of a long explanation, and then I realized that all I needed to say is I help leaders become more self-aware. And blind spots are the flip side of that, the things that we're not aware of about our personality, about our behavior, about how we show up in the workplace. And they're different than, they're not simple mistakes in the fact that we have our tried and true way of responding. We have our personality and we have our default ways of responding to situations. And, I work with successful leaders, so most of the time they're right on target. But those times when they're not, when they're doing what normally works for them and it's not working, or it's falling on people in a way that they're having a negative response, that's what a blind spot is. It's when that shows up, they're not aware of it, but other people often are.
Is it safe to say that all of us have blind spots?
Yeah, it's an error in the system.
Yeah.
Just how we're built.
Yeah. How did your clinical psychology background shape your approach to executive coaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a clinical psychologist, I'd treated patients for a decade or more full-time in a private practice. And as you all and your listeners know, that there's a map, there's a diagnostic manual. Somebody comes in, I'm trying to figure out what's the problem, where do they fit in the categorization of mental disorders. And then there are a variety of therapeutic techniques to help the person once you figure out, where they fit. When I became an executive coach, to be frank, I was just so disappointed that nothing like that existed. There's a great science of leadership, a lot there, but that's about kind of generally what works and what's best practices in leadership, but it doesn't take into account the individual personality. And so the book is really an outgrowth of my years as a clinical psychologist, years as a business entrepreneur, CEO myself, and years as a coach of trying to come up with that blueprint to direct really what needs fixing and then how to go about fixing it.
And of course, you're still learning.
Yes.
If you're like me, when you're working with someone in a coaching capacity, sometimes you might start to think of them as a patient rather than as a client. because sometimes they really need help.
There's a much stricter guidelines about how you behave as a psychotherapist with a patient.
Of course.
And I really enjoyed the fact that with leaders, they're well put together. I didn't have to be as careful and cautious about overwhelming them with feedback. And they want help quickly and they want to move fast.
Right.
That part of things, it felt like a much more equal relationship than it often did in the confines of my therapy office.
What patterns do you notice across leaders that make blind spots sometimes impossible to ignore?
Yeah, so I have, and we'll talk about them, I have 6 areas of blind spots that I've identified. And I think probably the easiest one for people to recognize is when their strengths actually are getting in the way. When I would do 360 interviews with people that are working with a leader, most of those, as most people did them, tended to fall into 2 buckets. What are the strengths and what are the opportunities to improve? And most leaders were like, I know what my strengths are. Help me just figure out what's not working well. And I tended to, when I first started, to look at those as 2 separate buckets. But then I started to notice a pattern where often the weaknesses, the problems, were really the flip side of the strength. The decisive leader was great and showed that decisiveness, but at times that decisiveness flipped over and turned into arrogance or dismissing other people's feedback and input because they were already ready to move on to a decision. So kind of being able to connect the strengths with an overused strength was, to me, what opened my eyes to finding these blind spots.
Well, and I've seen people who are excellent with details, a strength, but then they become a micromanager, and they don't notice that they've become a micromanager.
Yeah.
Would that be an example?
That's a perfect example. It's exactly right. And your point about not noticing is because it works well for us. We've usually risen in our careers and gotten positive feedback.
Been rewarded for it.
And rewarded for it, right. And so how could that be a problem? And it's so tricky because it isn't a problem for most of the time. And so the real key is being able to recognize, when does it tip over? What are those situations? Then how can you become aware when it's being overused and it's not effective for you?
You mentioned defining 6 types or categories of blind spots. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. And this also reflects back to the question you asked earlier about my clinical psychology background.
Right.
I've been thinking about all of these areas for quite a while, and they all kind of came together for me. So the 6 are, if your listeners can imagine, 3 concentric circles like a target. There's an outer ring, a middle ring, and then a bullseye in the center. And on the outer ring are 2 blind spot areas, identity and behavior. And why they're on the outside is because those are the ones that we're most aware of or have most access to be aware of. We can see our behavior. We can look at it. Other people can give us feedback very quickly about how we behaved. And our identity are often the name tags we wear. I'm an engineer, I'm a leader, I'm a husband, father, child, whatever it is. But there are some of those identities that are deeply inside us and we never really kind of question them. Then in the middle range are 3 areas that are pretty fixed and hardwired: our emotions, our intellect, and our traits. When we were talking before about somebody who can micromanage, that fits into the trait category. And then in the very center is what is kind of the engine in the system. What makes us, what pushes us, what motivates us, our motives, our drives, why we do what we do. And in all 6 of these areas, there's a risk for blind spots. And we all have them. We all have them in all the areas at certain times. And only at times do they really get in our way.
Well, it seems to me that 2 people could have the same blind spot. You could identify the same blind spot, but it might be motivated differently. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it could show up differently. And all 6 of we're complex individuals, beings, organisms, and all these things influence each other. So I organized in the way I described because the motive, to your point, really seeps into all the other ones. And you're right, a motive with a particular trait will make that trait expressed one way. A different motive would make that same trait be expressed in a different way.
Why are blind spots so difficult for leaders to detect on their own?
Because they really are. We act on our impulses, our default pattern recognition. We don't sit there and evaluate everything we do, or we never get anything done. If everything was analyzed, so we're reacting automatically, and so we don't notice when when the situation really is calling for something different than our automatic response. There's interesting research by Dunning and Kruger on how people tend to overestimate their own abilities. So we really aren't great judges of ourselves. We only really know ourselves really well, and we tend to think of ourselves, most characteristics psychologists see as fitting in a normal distribution, the bell curve. And we tend to think of ourselves as normal for the things that are just, not that important to us, and the things we really like about ourselves, we tend to see that we're on the kind of extreme positive end.
Right.
And Dunning and Kruger really measured these things and said, we really don't judge ourselves effectively in that kind of way.
Is it possible for a blind spot to be a strength in disguise?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, that's the most common one for people to recognize. I tell people, take your strengths. So you're decisive, you're confident, you're organized, you're creative. And what happens if you add the modifier word TOO in front of it? What happens when you're too organized? What happens when you're too confident?
Right.
What happens when you're, too creative? Those are the times when your strength can tip over and become problematic.
My mind just goes wild when you say that, because I can think of so many behaviors that are perfectly fine in moderation. But,
yes,
I'm thinking of in the workplace, somebody can be too friendly.
Right.
And that's not a good thing.
Right. Exactly right.
So what's the most common blind spot that you see in high-performing leaders?
Blind spots really occur across all of these. I don't know if there's any one that is more common because we're all unique individuals. As I said earlier, this trait one is often the easiest one to see, but I definitely see identity blind spots tend to show up when people at times of change. Often when you've been promoted or you move into a new role or a new company, and you may be holding on to those identities from your previous role and not even quite recognizing that you're doing that. And so identity blind spots are when your identity and your role are not completely aligned. So that's a very common one at those times of change and stress.
How do blind spots affect team dynamics and organizational culture?
That's my next book, I guess. And I'm really, just as an aside, this book is not a how-to book. This book really is hopefully thought-provoking. I end each chapter with awareness ideas so that you can try to figure out where your blind spots are. I also give actions to try to get beyond them. But I really hope this book stimulates a lot of other thinking. And I think the whole area of team dynamics and culture is an area where I think it's ripe for blind spots to appear. I remember, I think it was the Apollo 13 and, explosion and disaster. And when they talked about what happened there, they had all gotten into a particular kind of mind think that didn't allow for other kinds of possibilities. And that clearly was a group blind spot. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to kind of extend these concepts into teams and organizations.
What role does feedback play in uncovering blind spots, and why is it often ignored?
Yeah, that is the best way. There's kind of a catch-22 in this, right? If you have a blind spot, how can you really know what your blind spot is?
Right.
And so the best way is through feedback. And the work I do as an executive coach is interview-based 360s, where I can really ask the interviewee about the leader and follow up with questions, and then be able to take that information and share it with the leader in a way that they can digest and understand, not get overly defensive about, not argue with, but for me to kind of create take the feedback and look for the patterns and create a really meaningful report and discussion with the leader. And that's the first step, is to begin to understand how you show up is not always your intention. Your impact is different than your intention. And leaders beginning to kind of see that that's not what I meant. I'm sure that isn't what you meant, but you're getting feedback. That's how it came across.
I'm sure you've had clients, as I have, who intimidate people, and it never occurs to them that they intimidate people.
Yes.
And by virtue of intimidating them, they are denying themselves the opportunity to get the best work out of their team. And they're totally blind to it. And then when you sit down with them as an external consultant and give them that very straightforward feedback, they often say something like, "Why didn't somebody tell me this?" Well, because you'd bite their head off.
Right.
They're afraid of you. I'm not afraid of you. So
right, or they were kind of telling you, but you weren't listening.
you didn't notice.
I had one leader tell me that just so clearly what you're saying. He said, every time I've been promoted, I've gotten less and less feedback because
for sure.
The power dynamics. And he said, now that I'm CEO, the only people that tell me when I screw up are my wife and kids.
Yeah.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
So that brings up a question I think you may have answered, but let's dig a little bit. How do leaders typically respond when a blind spot is revealed to them? What's been your experience?
Yeah, probably like other consultants, I often get to the leader in two different ways. Many times the leader asks me to do a 360 feedback. They really are very curious. They want to grow. They want to get better, and they want to find out what other people are experiencing in their leadership. And then sometimes they get brought in by the CEO, by the head of HR, by somebody else to work with somebody. And those leaders are starting off with a little bit of defensiveness because they know something's wrong and they're not necessarily excited about finding out what it is. So, I'm sure like you, you build the skills of the art of coaching and the art of consulting in a way that, I'm there to help somebody. My work is not about performance improvement reviews. My work is about developing people and to be better leaders. And there's confidentiality around what we're working on and guidelines, and I'm in their corner to make them the most effective person they can be. So it takes a while sometimes to build the trust around all of that. And often I'll disclose about myself. I've been a CEO and a leader, and I'm very aware of where I screwed up. And sometimes just going through all that, people can get comfortable and see that we're there to help them be more effective. And leaders, as you well know, they can be doing 30 other things than talking to me. So if we're going to meet and I'm going to charge a lot of money and take a lot of time, let's make sure we really use it wisely.
Yeah. I'm smiling as you tell me that. It's reminding me of a time I was going to do a 2-day communication workshop for a senior team, and the CEO came in to introduce me to the group, and he said, "Now, Dr. Duncan is here. He's going to help you. We've got a lot of problems here, and you all listen up because I think he can be of help to you." And then he started to leave the room, and I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, I have a lot of work to do." And I said, "Yes, sir, you do. And it's in this room. Have a seat right here." And I thought, what's the worst thing that can happen? He can fire me. But he stayed, and he learned a lot in those 2 days, and he started talking openly with his people, and they started talking openly with him. I mean, we had some significant breakthroughs there. Talk about blind spots.
That's such a great story. And, my version of that, sometimes a leader comes in and says, "I've got to give somebody some really tough feedback. Help me give them some tough feedback." And I'm thinking my question is, have you shared the tough feedback you've received first? Have you been vulnerable? Have you demonstrated
Right.
how to receive tough feedback to your team? If you're just delivering it and you're never receiving it, we need to start at the top with that, and they need to, as you showed, they need to be able to role model and demonstrate.
Absolutely. So how do you help leaders move from blind spot awareness to actual behavior change?
Yeah, one of the misconceptions, and I think there are many coaches to the detriment of coaching, have made this mistake. They talk about transformation, or they talk about these great changes that they're going to make, and that sounds wonderful in a very conceptual way. But I've been a psychotherapist for a long time and a coach. I have never transformed anybody, nor should I, nor could I in any way. So the first place I start with is we're not talking about changing who you are. We're talking about making small little tweaks in what you do. I described, much of the who we are is hardwired. Our emotions, our traits, our intellect, those things aren't going to change. But how you show up with those, how you express those can be small little changes that have huge impact. And so I start there with leaders and say, coaching comes from athletics and sports, and what happens for elite athletes. The golf coach changes your grip by 1/4 of an inch and you get 20 more yards on your drive, or the ski instructor has you bend your knees and lead forward a tiny bit more, and all of a sudden you're skiing effortlessly. So that's what we're focusing on, is what are the really small changes that are going to have a huge impact.
So in a leadership context, how does the concept of blind spots relate to emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think they overlap a lot.
Sure.
There are a lot of great things, as I said earlier, in the science of leadership, and I would say EQ is one of those for sure. And then you need to take those concepts of EQ and be able to apply them to who you are as a personality. You and I can read the EQ book, and we can come away with the same 5 things that we think are super important out of that we're going to apply. And you and I will totally apply them differently because we have different personalities. We're aware of different things about ourselves. So emotion is one of my 6 areas, and I look at how aware people are. I have 5 different levels of emotion that correspond very similarly to the EQ. And how aware are you of your own feelings? How aware are you broadly of feelings in general? How aware are you of other people's feelings? How able are you to manage your feelings? And how able are you to be strategic about using your emotions in a very strategic way to create effect downstream in your organization? So those are the ways that we kind of filter the EQ and emotional blind spots together.
I had a wonderful conversation recently with Dr. Amy Edmondson at Harvard, the expert on psychological safety, which leads to the question, how can organizations create cultures, and what can leaders do to help create a culture that enables people to surface blind spots safely?
Yeah, a really important point. So my book is story driven, and I really think that it just kind of normalizes it for everybody. And so we can start by talking about stories about ourselves and other people that we work with, and injecting some humor in that. This isn't about shaming. This isn't about weaknesses. I really avoid the word weakness. I like to talk about our gifts and our gaps, and we all have these things. And so normalizing all of it to begin with in all sorts of ways, I think creates a culture of openness. And then the concept of disclosure, self-disclosure breeds self-disclosure. And like our earlier discussion about the leader, it has to start with the leader. And I would want to work with the leader first and get them pretty far along their blind spotting awareness journey. And then they can begin to share about themselves and create an environment that is what we're here for, is for us all to be more effective and to be more effective together. How do you compensate for my blind spots because you have strengths where I have gaps, and vice versa? And looking at it in a team kind of way, in a cultural kind of way, I think there's a lot of ways to create a sense of this is all kind of a positive momentum flywheel for improvement.
So many leaders are under constant pressure to perform. How can they avoid developing blind spots when they are so focused on results? Sometimes quarterly results are so much of a pressure on someone.
Yeah. I mean, I had one leader I was working with who became CEO, and I met him like the first week after he got promoted into the role. And I walked into his office with floor-to-ceiling windows, and he said to me, "Marty, when I got into this office, the first thought in my head, a tall skyscraper, first thought in my head was, don't jump out." And so that was the first work we did was, you're the same person when you were 2 rungs down the ladder and 10 rungs down the ladder as you are now. You know more and you're more experienced, but your personality is still the same thing. So don't get a bloated head or, a sense of all this responsibility on your shoulders. It's all true, but we still got to get you back to being who you are and how you can be most effective in who you are and authentic in who you are in a way that's very, positive and motivating to your team and company.
Well, whether it's a new leader or someone who's been in a leadership position for quite a while, what's the biggest, or at least one of the biggest misconceptions about leadership that can create blind spots for leaders?
So I think this is where one place to start is that identity blind spot. This often happens, when you're promoted to a new role that's a significant elevation. So even as that first step, when you're a subject matter expert and you now become a manager, a supervisor, and if you're still holding on to the identity of being the subject matter expert, you're the marketing guru, and that's your identity, and that's still what matters to you, you're going to struggle with all the requirements that you have to now manage other people. And if your identity can't embrace those management things as something you really want and want to have as part of your identity, then you probably need to really have a good look in the mirror about whether you really should have taken the advancement or not. And there should be some sense of loss. If you're giving up being the expert marketer because now you're spending time learning how to be a leader, and some of the people on your team are learning all the new things that are going on in marketing, you should feel a sense of a loss of your identity. There should be some grief. It's like, damn, I used to be the best at that, and now I feel like I'm a couple clicks behind, and that's okay because you've made that decision. So really getting that kind of clear look at yourself and making sure you're aligned with your role is really key to not have a misstep.
Well, confronting blind spots, honestly, often involves discomfort, for sure. What advice do you have for leaders who find this process difficult or emotionally challenging?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is, as I said earlier, it is about making small tweaks. So this isn't about changing who you are. But, maybe one example, I had a leader who was very confident, very decisive, overly very curious, would ask a lot of questions, but was losing team members who were describing him as arrogant. And there's no way he saw himself as arrogant. But in talking with him, I could help him see that when he stopped asking questions, when he thought he knew the answer, that's when he could be dismissive to his team members. He was ready to move on, and you just get up and leave the room. And getting the awareness that really the change he needs to make, he can still be just as decisive, just as confident, just as curious as he was before, but he needs to change his behavior and not just get up and leave the room and not close off the conversation, but to say, I think I'm near a decision right now, but let me sit on it for a couple of days. Let's meet again next Tuesday and talk about it. So I think helping people see with examples that these are really small changes that you need to make, and they'll have a big impact on your work relationships.
Well, how do leaders effectively manage the tension between embracing their vulnerabilities, I think it's safe to use that word, and maintaining their authority?
Yeah, one of the ways I began to think about motives, David McClellan, an organizational psychologist at Harvard, quite a while back, talked about 3 core motives for all of us in work. And he talked about power, achievement, and affiliation. And we all have those in different quantities. And so one of the exercises I do go through with leaders is trying to understand, as we talked earlier about, what is motivating them. and how important is power as a motive to the question you're asking right now, versus how important is achievement and how important is affiliation, and when to shift and balance those depending on the venue, the situation, the problem, the people that they're interacting with. And if somebody's getting feedback, like, oh, all he cares about, is being in charge and making the big decisions, then probably people are experiencing that person as totally involved in power. All he cares about is money. Money's another kind of measure of power. So those are times to really have a good, really deep talk with somebody about what is important to them. And clearly you need all three of those to be successful as a leader. You need to care about results and achievement, and for your own sake, for your own desire to really do a good job. You need to care about other people and surrounding yourself with people and doing things as a team. And you need to care about making the tough decisions and being, in power, and how to balance those and be aware of where you are in balancing all three of those.
Well, Marty, if our listeners could do one thing today to begin uncovering their own blind spots, what would it be?
One easy one, I'll give you two. I mean, one I mentioned earlier was put that word modifier TOO in front of their strengths and see if there's something that they can learn there. The other is in the area of identity. We all have a brand at work, whether we know it or not. And I would encourage people to ask at work, what's my brand? And they may be surprised about what people actually tell them about what comes across to other people in terms of who they are. And that will give them some good food for thought of where they may want to make some adjustments.
Thank you so much, Marty. We appreciate your insights into how blind spots can impact our leadership effectiveness. You've been very generous with your time, and I know our listeners join me in thanking you. As leaders, we often pride ourselves on what we know, our strategies, our strengths, our successes. But as Dr. Dubin reminds us, it's what we don't see that can quietly shape our impact. Blind spots are not flaws to be hidden. They are invitations to grow. And when we have the courage to confront them, we unlock a deeper kind of leadership, one rooted in self-awareness, empathy, and lasting change. So whether you're leading a team, a company, or simply trying to lead yourself more effectively, Blindspotting offers a powerful lens for transformation. The question isn't whether you have blind spots, it's whether you're ready to see them. For those of you who'd like to know more about Marty and his work, go to martindubin.com. That's Martin Dubin, Dubin.com. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadershop.net. That's leadershop.net. In other episodes of Leadership, I share my exclusive conversations with top thought leaders who offer smart tips to boost your effectiveness in both your professional and personal life. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay informed on what's coming your way. Trust me, folks, you don't want to miss any of our episodes. When you subscribe, you'll also receive regular doses of high-value written content. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.